But who is here with us today is the wonderful Sarah Ronas, who will lead us through the highlights of our last week in Talmud study. Dr. Ronas.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I see some folks already introducing themselves in the chat. If you haven't done that yet, please say hello and tell us where you're joining us from. Um, I'm joining you today from hopefully rainy San Antonio, where if it rains just enough, the humidity might break. So, Daf Yomi today was actually this week was actually a little bit different from a lot of what we've been reading in Baba Metzia. We had an interesting pause from some of the discussions of acquisition to learn some stories about the greatness of various rabbis. We that was a real chunk of what we did this week. Then we discussed what an employer owes an employee. And that led to this beautiful discussion of feasting in the Bible. And one of my favorite, agadot or stories, narratives of the Talmud, which is this extended discussion about the way that God treats us as Abraham treated the strangers who came to his door. Really sort of a beautiful text to think with. Then we shifted to talk about what kinds of employees can eat agricultural produce as they're working on it, and what kinds of produce are eligible to be eaten. And that led us to a discussion about, hey, what about the fact that not all employees are human? So what are the laws around letting or not letting a cow or an ox that's eating for you, that's working for you, eat while working? Which again then led us to a discussion of tithing, right, taking the tenth and giving it to the priests and the Levites, which then led us to a discussion of the punishments for transgressing the laws of how to treat working animals. And since we were talking about animals, why not then just jump into crossbreeding? And that was our week. So a really rich set of ideas to think with this week. And I actually want to start with the text, and then we're going to open it up to a bit of a discussion. So let me see if I can share my screen. Here we go. And so I'm going to share my screen. I'm also going to drop a link into the chat so that if you'd like to follow along on your own page, you are welcome to, but you do not need to. And I just want to, this is part of the section about the greatness of rabbis that we were talking about. And I think it's going to open up a really interesting discussion for us. So I'll read it in the English. The translation here I adapted from Sefaria. When Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Chia would debate, Hanina would say to Rabbi Chia, "Can you debate with me? Right? Who are you to fight me on this? Heaven forbid! If the Torah were forgotten from the Jewish people, I could restore it with my analysis." The word there for analysis is the word pilpul. Pilpul is later on becomes understood as a very technical form of Talmud study, which is at an extremely abstract high level of Talmud study. Rabbi Chia then responds to Rabbi Hanina, "Can you debate with me? As I am acting to ensure that the Torah not be forgotten by the Jewish people. What do I do?" This to me reads very much like Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor in Proverbs, someone who just like does all the things. So here's what he does. I go and sow flax, right? You need flax. Why? To twine nets. And then I use the nets to hunt deer and to feed their meat to orphans. Okay, so you're hunting deer to feed the meat to orphans because you don't want to waste the meat, but that's not actually why you're hunting deer, Isaiah. What does he do with the rest of the deer? He turns it into parchment, right? He turns the deer skin into parchment. Then I prepare parchment and I write the 5 books of the Torah on them. I go to a city and I teach 5 children the 5 books, and I teach 6 children the 6 orders of the Mishnah. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves here that the Mishnah is oral Torah. So he's writing the written Torah, but he knows the oral Torah orally, and he's teaching it orally. Right? So only 5 deer apparently had to die for this cause. And I say to them, until I return and come, read to each other and teach each other. This is how I act to ensure that the Torah will not be forgotten by the Jewish people. So we have two different models of what greatness looks like here. One is an extremely abstract level of Talmudic analysis, which could, with that kind of analysis and derivation, could generate the entire Torah, right? If it gets lost and one person can understand the principles behind it, he can regenerate the entire thing. And I think it's worth noting that the Talmud doesn't say he couldn't, right? So yeah, definitely, Rabbi Hanina can do that. The second model is the model of Rabbi Hanina, which starts out without analysis at all. It starts out agriculture and weaving and hunting and cooking, and then scraping to make parchment, right? It's a very physical set of behaviors. And then what he does is he writes down these texts, he transmits them to 11 children, right? Because of the 5 and the 6. And then he says to them, I'm leaving, you guys teach each other until I get back. Right, so I'm not leaving forever, so it's not going to be chaos. That when the teacher sort of steps out for a minute, says, "I'll be back in 5 minutes. I want to make sure you're all working. I see you all working when I get back." Which of those two models actually is successful at allowing the Torah to be restored? This explains what Rabbi said, how great are the deeds of Chiyah. So Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, who is the compiler editor of the Mishnah, excuse me, he says, yeah, and Chiyah is the best. Or is at least great, and he doesn't say anything about Fanina. So I'm curious, what are your takeaways from this text? And you can either raise your hand or you can drop something in the chat. And Ben, the way I am sharing screen, I can't actually see the chat. So if you see the chat, please let us know what you see. What are your takeaways from this text? Claudette?
What I'm hearing is that to keep Torah alive is not about just talking about it or debating it. It's acting and living it out. One rabbi, teaches it, but also live it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, right? So there's a doing and a talking about it.
Yeah. And you keep Torah alive also by what you're doing today. Like you studied it, but you're sharing it. And because you're sharing it and because we are learning from you, if we keep talking about it, you also become a learner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see, Leah, your hand is up.
It seems to be the difference between the ivory tower mentality and the hands-on lead by example. I like both. It's part of me is so Litvak and part of me is so Galiciana, and I see value in both. This helping people to help themselves. You go teach 5 children 5 books and you teach 6 children the 6 orders of Mishnah, they're going to help themselves. They're going to pass that on. Whereas, both are valuable. What happens in the ivory tower can then be disseminated amongst the people in ways that the people can better understand. We really need both.
And I think Saul says something similar in the chat, which is both of these, right? Both of Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Hanina are both rabbis, right? There's room in the rabbinic movement for both of these modes of restoring Torah. Absolutely, absolutely. I want to note Bob Markey, and Bob, this is actually kind of where my brain went in the chat. Bob writes, does this say something about how some rabbis may have been more astute teachers than others? And I really think, as someone, I teach in the ivory tower. I am a professor when I'm not here with you. And to me, this really is two very different models of teaching. They're both teaching, but they are, one is one is your classic, you might think, sort of the word that gets used is the phrase that gets used is sage on a stage, right? The classic lecture, somebody's at the front talking, everybody is maybe taking dramatic notes, and that's the class. And then the other is a more active kind of learning where we see you're actually getting the students to talk, to engage, to bring their own insights, and to really teach themselves. And I think one of the things that Rabbi is pointing out, Rabbi Judah, the patriarch, is that when it comes to restoring the Torah, and also just fun fact, pedagogy, today, studies have shown that active learning helps students retain what they know far more than the sage on the stage model. Which is hard for those of us who are teachers who grew up where teaching looked like lecturing, for us to make that shift, but that actually active learning is the way. Yes, Betsy, the original flipped classroom. Daniel, I see your hand up. I don't know how to unmute you. I think that's Ben.
Yes.
Okay.
I find it very interesting that Rabbi Hanina is talking about restoring the Torah with his own analysis, when I believe we are taught that we take the original text and we interpret it for each generation, which is what, I'm sorry, I got it backwards, don't I?
No, you have it right. Hanina is
Okay. Haya is saying, here's the text. I'm going to teach you what the text says, and then you're responsible for interpreting yourself, which is, in my mind, a much more modern and a healthy way to look at Torah, keeping Torah alive. You don't just interpret it once and then hand it down to each generation without changes.
And I think, scholars of pedagogy today would agree with you, where active learning also helps students make it their own and make it relevant to themselves. Absolutely. I think there's, and as several folks have noted, I think there's room in the rabbinic movement for both. There's room in the Talmud for both kinds of things. But in terms of what would work for the next generation, Daniel, I agree with you. And I think more importantly, Rabbi Judah, the patriarch, agrees with you. Absolutely, right? That learning has to not just be from a really smart person, it has to be healthy and effective. Excellent. And Aaron, you're noting, right? Maybe Hanina understood it all better. It's entirely possible, right? It's entirely possible that actually Rabbi Hanina understood the logic behind the rabbinic arguments better than Rabbi Chia did. But that's not the question. The question is, who could, if God forbid Torah disappeared, who could generate the Torah anew, right? Who could make sure it was restored, which is a different metric than who has the better understanding of the logical understanding of it, right? Of the logical framework behind it. All right, I'm going to stop share. So when I understood this, when I read this, I thought the thing we should really do today in our last 15 minutes is to decenter the teacher, right? Inspired by Rabbi Chia and his healthier and more effective way of teaching. I want to turn it to you now. There was so much in this week's Daf. So what stories jumped out at you? What parts of this week's Daf are you thinking about? And maybe more importantly, what parts of this week's Daf have you reached out to somebody else and said, let me tell you what I just read or what I'm thinking about? You'll notice usually I say to you, oh, and drop in what the most interesting part of this week's Daf as you introduce yourselves. I didn't do that. I wanted to save it for now. So who'd like to share? And you can raise your hand or you can drop something in the chat, excuse me, which is, I guess, our own kind of Daf. Claudette, thank you for being brave.
Like you said, this week was very rich, but there are a few things that stood out for me. And one is when the muzzling of the animal. How today we pay attention to cruelty to animals, but centuries ago the rabbis debated how can they save that animal from being eating what they should not eat, whether they should be muzzled or not. And so it tells me that centuries ago, our people cared about the fact that animals were to be taken care of. So, you know, today it's a modern day thing today we pay attention to, but centuries ago it was. And another thing that I was very much struck by is about the law of castration and how we are not allowed to. And I thought about the fact that how revolutionary our religion was in centuries ago, because that was the custom of people out there to castrate their slaves so that they cannot live with the women of their culture. And Judaism came along and changed those things. So those things were, you know, very much on my mind when I was looking at that this week.
Absolutely. So before we get some other examples, I think, you know, it's worth remembering the rabbis and the Jews in general were absolutely part of the cultures they lived around. And very often we see them have principles that align with the cultures they have around. But every once in a while, or actually more than every once in a while, quite often, what we see is being a part of the culture means being in conversation with the culture. But being in conversation, anyone who's ever had a conversation knows not all conversations are, yes, I completely agree with you. Right? Being in conversation with the people around you sometimes means, yes, I agree with you. Sometimes on things that maybe perhaps you and I would rather they didn't, like slavery. But it also can mean saying, no, I don't agree with you. I'm in conversation with you. We're having a conversation about this topic, but actually, let me tell you why what I believe is different. And for the rabbis, and we see this in the discussion of muzzling and castration, the reason that they point to for why they are different is the Torah says so. And Erica, I see your question in the chat. The rabbis are specifically talking about the castration of animals in this conversation. And when it comes to modern medical procedures, I say ask your local spiritual or legal authority about that one. So I'm seeing that Lynn in the chat wrote that your study group is much taken with the idea that an employer has to feed and treat employees humanely. And I don't know if we can find Lynn, but Lynn, can you tell us why your group was so excited about that?
Yeah, thanks. For a minute there, it wouldn't let me unmute. We just, there was just really a lot about that. And I think that was from Torah law, right? We know that the animals can eat while they're walking along in the field, and it applied to humans too. And we just really like that. There was a reading today that said, even if the laborer is hired just to do a little bit of work, if the laborer gets hungry, they have to be allowed to eat while they're on the job, even if they eat more than the value that they're being paid, or more than the value that what they're harvesting is going to get at market. And so we like that the workers were being centered here.
Yeah, and to me that really resonated as well, because as I said when I introduced myself, I'm currently in Texas. That's where I live. And 2 years ago, the Texas legislature spent a period of time debating whether to get rid of required water and rest breaks for people who work outside in the summer.
Well, Florida did get rid of them.
No, Texas did too. They did. They were debating it, and then they got rid of it. But thinking about, right, and the heat yesterday it was like 105 with the feels like temperature. So thinking about the real practical implications for life in places that get really hot, but even just for quality of life. I agree with you, and I think those are issues that are still debated today. I see Aaron. I'm going to pull something from the chat, and then I'm going to come back to the hands up. I see Aaron in the chat writes that God teaches diplomacy and consideration in the story of God with Abraham and Sarah. Absolutely. And I don't know if there's more you want to say about that, Aaron. We can find you and unmute you, but it was just that. I think I'm going to make a bold statement here. God doesn't tell the truth in that story. And we have a word for people who don't tell the truth, and the word is lie, right? God lies to Abraham, about what Sarah said. And it's a very white lie, right? It's not an epic lie. But pointing out that when we think of, the value of radical honesty, actually, maybe that's not the value. Maybe the actual value is, how do people live good lives together with God as our model? I found that really, really striking. Yeah. Leah, I see your hand. Wait, Leah, you got muted again.
There we go.
Okay.
When I was writing my Devar Torah on yesterday, finishing it up, or the day before, I don't remember, I was absolutely astounded to read in the daily Daf reference to exactly what I was puzzling over. I was writing about chapter 27 of Bechukotai. And what is this substitution thing? And why is it so important? And why is the substituted out, the one that was substituted out, then still considered holy? And it led me right there. And then it said I needed to go to Timurah, to A, where it was repeated or elucidated a little bit. And it really, I don't believe in coincidence. I was trying to figure out what my take was on it. And I realized, two things. Promises, vows are binding. That's why the 40 lashes happen after that. But also, once something is declared holy, consecrated, it can't be unconsecrated, which means we really need to watch our words, watch what we say, because once it's said, it can't be unsaid. And if we make, we read Nidarim. We know what that's like to make a vow and then and then renege on it. It's hard to make a vow. It's hard to annul a vow. And so this provided the perfect ending to my ramblings for the week. And I was delighted to have read that. And my question is, when we get to Temurah, does that go into that even further? I have a funny feeling that's all about chapter 27.
It is.
Seems like it's such an addendum after all of this, the blessings and the curses, and then all of a sudden, what's all this? And it struck me after I read that this is an encapsulation of everything that Leviticus is talking about. It's about how we are holy, retain holiness, and have a responsibility toward holiness.
Yes, I think that's beautiful, Leah. Thank you. And I will note, for those of you who don't know what's coming, we will eventually, in quite a while, be studying the Talmud's tractate Temurah, which is all about, if you attempt to switch an animal that you've already dedicated, what happens with the original animal and what happens with the animal you attempt to switch. It's a great tractate. It's a hugely it's such a technical issue that people don't often look at it, but I think it's really rich, and it's got some very interesting things. And what I also really appreciate about Leah, what you said, and Lynn, your comments, and I see a lot of the other comments that are here, is we're not just, I think when we started out our journey through the Daf, many of us, we got the stories. We understood what you can learn from the stories. And what I'm seeing now in this conversation is we are still learning from the stories, I presented a story. But we're also now trying to derive what are the messages behind the legal discussions, behind the legal discussions about muzzling an animal or castration, behind the legal discussions of switching out an animal. And most of us, unless you are a vet and or a farmer who lived in the time of the temple, you're not doing any of those things, right? You're not worrying about muzzling oxen. You're not castrating animals willy-nilly. You're definitely not switching out the animal you dedicated for sacrifice to a different animal. And yet, there is so much for us to learn from those texts. And again, as Lynn is pointing out in the chat, learn from doesn't always mean agree with. Learn from means sit with, take seriously, ask questions about, talk about with others, pass it on to the next generation as an important text to think with, right? Do all of those things, engage. And I would even take it back to the pedagogy piece, engage actively, but also always be thinking critically about how this relates to our tradition today. Absolutely. So thank you all. You know, what I really wanted to highlight in this morning's talk, inspired by Rabbi Chia, is just the collective wisdom in this room, right? The absolute collective wisdom in this room. And I know we are sort of halfway through our journey through the Daf together. I know some of you have study groups. I know some of you like to do this alone, but this is my nice invitation to remember to talk about this with other people, because you have things to share and to pass on. And I think it only works, as Rabbi Judah Hanassi points out, it only works if we're talking to other people, passing it on, and actively engaging in this text. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful morning or afternoon or evening, whatever time of day it is where you are. And I look forward to seeing you next time I am here on a Thursday morning.
Thank you so
Bye.
much, Dr. Ronas. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next week.